Hi everyone, my name is Emillie de Keulenaar. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen and I'm also a researcher at the UN DPPA Innovation Cell. I'm also presenting here on behalf of my colleague David Janezashvili, who is bringing in the more humanitarian angle of this presentation on behalf of his work with USAID. So what I would like to do in this presentation was to kind of go over a case study here that we have been focused on for the past year to develop a number of methods to understand conflict and conciliation on the web at large, including on social media. So the case study that I'm presenting here is focused on what has been called the Second Nagorno Karabakh War, which opposed Azerbaijan against Armenia between September and early December of 2020. The conflict is historical, it has been going on for a number of decades, but in 2020 has gathered particularly an informational character, in the sense that not only have citizens engaged in the war online, on social media, but also states themselves have been heavily involved in trying to push one or another narrative in favor of one or the other side. So what we wanted to do in this respect was to study the web and social media as a place where users comment on the conflict, but also where they eventually amplify and sometimes aggravate the conflict with additional hate speech or incitement to violence. And we do that with a certain understanding that analyzing open source content on social media is intended to predict political developments, for conflict mediators and UN officers to adjust their public engagement accordingly, to also invite contributions from experts on the ground to inform the sorts of methods that we can design to understand conflict online. The second thing we wanted to do is to complement these existing methods, which in computational social sciences and new media studies are largely focused in polarization, to study conciliation. So we asked ourselves, okay, what does conciliation look like online? How does it take place? How can we capture and study it in the form of computational methods? The third element that we wanted to explore was to develop methods that could directly inform peace builders and mediators on the ground about the sorts of information deficits or information gaps that hamper understanding between opposed groups. And the fourth element was also to explore the role of platforms other than social media, with an understanding that there are other platforms of note that play an important role in structuring and giving access to information, ideas, and other elements that constitute the building blocks of conflict online. So one first easier example here is what we did for conflict monitoring. We used a number of natural language processing techniques to study something like rhetorical escalation. In this case, what we wanted to understand was to look into words that are frequently mentioned alongside concepts of note, for example, ethnicities. So what you see in this visualization here is for every column, which is a month, the top most frequently mentioned words next to Armenian in Azerbaijani in a given dataset of 1 million posts. And what we see here over time then is that, well, in the beginning in June, before the war truly escalated, Armenians were talked about as inhabitants or Armenian Russians, Armenian rule, and around October 2020, eventually were talked about as Armenian terror, Armenian wildness, Armenian terrorism, and so on. The second method that we tried exploring is what we called reconciliation analytics. So it was the instances in which one language group, for instance, Azerbaijani speakers, would talk about key historical issues for Armenians and vice versa. Here we see, for example, that something like the Khojaly genocide, which affected a majority of Azerbaijanis in the late 1990s, was mostly mentioned only by Azerbaijani speakers. However, an event like the Sumgai massacre or the Armenian genocide were also largely mentioned by Azerbaijani speakers. And so it seems this is an instance in which we can see a crossover, right? So an instance in which a growing group acknowledges one issue important to their opposition. However, when we look into the specific social media posts that mention these two issues, we see that they are mentioned largely pejoratively. So these are YouTube videos that largely try to propose another reading of the historical events that took place. The last example that we're presenting here has to do more with Wikipedia. We wanted to see the extent to which articles of importance, articles that talk about the issues that I describe here, were translated in both languages to facilitate mutual intelligibility between them. And we see that unfortunately that's not necessarily the case, that majority of articles that mention Armenians as casualties is indeed translated in Armenian, and the case in Azerbaijani also mostly translated in Azerbaijani. So if we were to summarize this into successes and limitations, what we can say is that there is indeed a truly very important potential to explore how conflict and conciliation takes place on the web at large, with an understanding that the web at large is an environment where groups form ideas, produce ideas, and knowledge about issues of note for conflict and conciliation. And with that understanding, we also think that the methods that we propose to develop here would be designed to inform mediators on how to complement information deficits or information silos between opposed groups. The limitations, of course, are that we are also using methods that are oftentimes a bit too superficial for the extent of expertise and the complexity of the phenomena that we are studying. And while this is a difficulty, we also think it is a very important opportunity to continue thinking about how to operationalize, right, how to mold this expertise and the concepts that derive therein into computational methods. And this is the general art that we are trying to call and propose as conflict and reconciliation analytics. Thank you very much.